On September 12, 2025, at 2:45 a.m., the U.S. Navy launched one of the boldest ambushes of the year in the Central Caribbean Sea. Their target was not a random vessel, it was a disguised freighter sailing under a false flag, run by the Venezuelan Coastal Serpent Syndicate with backing from Mexico's Jalisco Cartel. From the outside, it looked like a cargo hauler carrying ordinary freight, but U.S. intelligence had confirmed weeks earlier that it was no ordinary ship. Hidden beneath reinforced steel decks and welded bulkheads were 38 tons of narcotics, an arsenal of poison prepared for shipment northward, valued at nearly $5.8 billion on the street. Enough fentanyl, meth, and cocaine to flood entire states and wipe out millions of lives. The Navy had been following every move of this ship, tracking its path, analyzing encrypted communications, and waiting for the moment when it would slow down to conduct its transfer. That night, the moment came. Under the darkness of early morning, while much of the Caribbean was still quiet, the freighter reached a holding point northeast of Curaçao. Lights flickered on its deck as cartel guards prepared for what they thought would be a clean handoff to another vessel. Instead, it was the beginning of their downfall. The cartels had planned this voyage for months, treating it like a military operation. They split the cargo into layers: 9 tons of fentanyl in sealed drums, 13 tons of crystal meth stored in hidden crates, and 16 tons of cocaine compressed into blocks and wrapped for waterproofing. Every piece of cargo was protected by armed watchmen, 35 gunmen in total, carrying AK-74 rifles, PKM machine guns, grenades, and pistols. They believed they were untouchable because the freighter was disguised and armed like a fortress at sea. The plan was simple: meet another ship offshore, offload part of the cargo, and then send it through secret corridors into the U.S., where it would be broken down and sold for staggering profit. But what the cartel bosses didn't know was that every single step had been monitored. U.S. naval intelligence had tapped their satellite phones, cracked their GPS messages, and mapped every route. From the very beginning, the freighter was sailing into a trap, and the Navy was ready to spring it at the perfect moment. At 2:47 a.m., only minutes after slowing down, the freighter's crew began moving crates onto the open deck. Cartel fighters checked weapons, scanned the horizon, and laughed among themselves, unaware that dozens of eyes were already locked on them from miles away. Above them, a U.S. satellite tracked the vessel's exact position, while Navy analysts relayed constant updates to the amphibious ship shadowing nearby. Every flicker of deck light, every movement of cargo, every radio burst was monitored and logged. In those moments, the cartel believed it was preparing for another successful run, but the reality was very different. The Navy had closed the circle. The trap was tightening, and what came next would shock even the most hardened traffickers aboard that freighter. From just over the horizon, the U.S. Navy made its move. A San Antonio-class amphibious ship, massive and armed with the latest surveillance gear, had been shadowing the cartel freighter for hours. At the captain's signal, 8 RHIB boats roared to life, cutting across the black water with precision. Inside them were nearly 55 sailors and Marines, geared in body armor, night vision goggles, and carrying M4A1 carbines, MK48 machine guns, and precision sniper rifles. Overhead, the thumping rotors of a Seahawk helicopter churned the night air. Its GAU 21.50 caliber heavy machine gun was mounted and ready, tracking every heat signature from the freighter below. The Navy's orders were short and clear: intercept, seize, and rescue. At 2:58 a.m., the RHIBs began surrounding the vessel, engines throttled low for stealth. The Seahawk dimmed its lights and drifted into position above the stern. The cartel still had no idea that war was minutes away from crashing onto their deck. At exactly 3 a.m., the first sign appeared. Massive searchlights from the RHIBs swept the deck, exposing cartel fighters caught in the act of moving crates. A booming voice echoed through loudspeakers in both Spanish and English. "This is the United States Navy. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately." For one long second, the deck froze. Cartel guards glanced at each other, guns in their hands, fear and pride mixing together. But hesitation lasted only that second. A mounted heavy machine gun at the bow opened fire, the barrel sparking red in the darkness. A torrent of tracer rounds ripped into the air, aimed at the Seahawks circling overhead. Within moments, the night turned into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the deck like lightning. The sea itself seemed alive with fire as bullets skipped off waves and smashed into steel. The cartel had chosen to fight. The Navy's response was immediate and brutal. From the RHIBs, snipers took their shots with deadly accuracy, dropping gunners before they could reload. Sailors laid down automatic bursts with MK-48s, shredding barrels and steel plating the cartel had tried to use as cover. Above, the Seahawks' 50 caliber gun thundered to life, cutting across the bow with streams of heavy fire that silenced the cartel's mounted gun in seconds. Sparks flew, smoke poured across the deck, and grenades rolled across the steel floor, filling the night with explosions. The smell of burning fuel mixed with cordite as the firefight raged. Yet the Navy kept its discipline. Every burst was calculated, every shot counted. By 3:10 a.m., the freighter's deck was a battlefield. Fires burning, fighters screaming, bodies sprawled, and steel scarred from heavy fire. The cartel had thrown everything it had into resistance, but the reality was already set. The Navy was not backing down. The sea was no longer theirs. By 3:17 a.m., the cartel freighter was no longer just under attack. It was collapsing under the weight of precision. Fires burned in several corners of the deck, sparked by grenades and heavy machine gun bursts. More than a dozen cartel fighters were already down, some injured, some silent, their rifles clattering across the floor as smoke thickened around them. One desperate narco rushed forward carrying an RPG launcher, screaming in Spanish as he shouldered the weapon. The rocket fired, a streak of flame in the night, but it missed wide and slammed harmlessly into the sea with a muffled boom that sent a geyser of water into the air. The failed shot was their last chance. Navy sailors pressed their advance, their RHIBs hooking firmly onto the freighter's hull as boarding ladders were thrown up and clanged hard against steel. Marines moved first, climbing quickly, weapons raised, covering every angle as more smoke poured out from the freighter's burning sections. Cartel fighters tried to regroup, but panic set in. Some dropped their rifles and crawled to the ground. Others fired blindly into the haze, but it no longer mattered. The turning point had come. The ship's defenders were broken, and the Navy was about to take full control. Within minutes, the first Navy teams stormed the deck. Boots pounded against metal, rifles swept across the smoke-filled shadows, and shouts echoed, "Clear! Move forward!" Cartel survivors threw their hands in the air and dropped to the ground. Their earlier defiance turned to silence. Marines cuffed them one by one, pushing them face down as more teams fanned out below deck. In the belly of the freighter, the real shock came. Sailors pushed open steel doors and entered cavernous holds where hidden compartments had been built under false flooring. Inside were mountains of narcotics, 38 tons in total, shrink-wrapped into tight, waterproof pallets. There were blocks of cocaine stacked like bricks, crystal meth sealed in drums, and fentanyl packed in industrial crates. The scale was staggering, worth more than $5.8 billion on the streets. But the discovery went further. Down a narrow hallway, a locked cabin was forced open. Inside, 4 hostages sat bound and terrified. 2 women and 2 children, kidnapped for trafficking networks. Their eyes widened when the sailors burst in, relief breaking across their faces as restraints were cut away. They were pulled to safety, wrapped in Navy jackets, and rushed topside into the arms of medics waiting on the deck. The operation, already one of the Navy's largest drug seizures, had now become a mission of rescue. What started as a firefight was now a liberation, and with the cargo exposed and hostages freed, the mission had reached its most decisive moment. By 3:55 a.m., the freighter was no longer a fortress. It was a wreck. Fires burned through its midsection, thick black smoke rising into the dark sky. The Navy had full control of the deck. Cartel survivors, 27 in total, were lined up in restraints, guarded closely by Marines with rifles slung tight to their chests. They sat silent, staring down at the steel beneath them, their empire of crime gone in a single night. Below deck, sailors double-checked every compartment, pulling out more crates of drugs hidden under false walls and even inside water tanks. The ship was loaded far beyond what even intelligence had expected. Billions of dollars worth of poison that would never reach American streets. But the vessel itself was too damaged to tow. Fires had eaten through bulkheads, seawater had begun flooding lower compartments, and the freighter was no longer stable. Orders were given to sink it. Demolition teams planted charges along the interior, wiring them carefully, while Marines evacuated the last prisoners and escorted the freed hostages onto RHIBS. At exactly 4:02 a.m., the countdown ended. A thunderous series of controlled blasts shook the sea, and flames burst upward as steel tore apart. Within minutes, the narco ship groaned, tilted, and sank beneath the waves. The ocean swallowed it whole, leaving only smoke and scattered debris on the surface. On nearby Navy decks, sailors stood watching as the cartel's multi-billion-dollar lifeline disappeared into black water. The endgame was complete. The operation had not only destroyed a ship, but had crippled a cartel's global network in one strike. When dawn broke over the Caribbean, the scale of the mission was clear. The U.S. Navy had wiped out $5.8 billion worth of narcotics in a single operation. 35 cartel fighters had been neutralized, 27 captured alive, and 4 innocent hostages rescued. It was a victory that went beyond drugs and money. It was a statement. For years, cartels had believed the sea gave them protection. Disguised ships, hidden routes, and armed escorts had allowed them to move freely, poisoning entire nations from the shadows. But this mission proved the sea was no longer theirs. Every GPS ping, every encrypted message, every strange movement was being tracked. The Navy had shown it could wait, plan, and strike with precision, turning the ocean from a safe passage into a trap. The message to cartels was simple. There is nowhere left to hide. The freighter was supposed to deliver death. Instead, it became a coffin for their empire. And for the rescued hostages, for the families who would never see those drugs on the streets, it was proof that even in the darkest hours, justice could still cut through the night like steel.